Welcome everybody, welcome to this webinar this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for Maximising System Value of the Energy Transition. It's great to have you with us. And I guess given the need to transform energy systems around the globe, it's only right that we've got an international audience, of course, to hear about the work today and to learn how it's been applied in a number of different countries. For those that don't know, I am Louise Kingham. I'm CEO of the Energy Institute, so delighted to have you join us for this event. And I would also like to thank Accenture for kindly sponsoring the webinar, which is important in its own right, of course, as you're going to find out over the course of the next hour and a half or so. But it also trails another EI event on the 6th of October later this year, Powering Net Zero. So if you want to register your interest with that one too, then please do via the Energy Institute. And for those of you that don't know much about the Energy Institute, we're an independent, not-for-profit professional body that brings together a network of professionals working across the entire energy system. We convene and facilitate debate and share and develop knowledge so that energy ultimately can be better understood, managed and valued. And as you can imagine, actually, there's never been a more important time to do just that as we navigate and deliver the transformation of energy systems globally. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome your chair for today's event, who is a very active member of that network and fellow of the Energy Institute that I've just described. Melissa Stark is Managing Director of Accenture with 27 years experience in the utilities and the broader energy industry, focusing on R&D, technology, investment decision support, operations and the supply chain. Melissa is Accenture's global lead for renewables and energy transition services for Accenture. And she was the project Accenture lead for the work on the World Economic Forum on the system value framework that you're going to hear about this afternoon in the path to maximising that system value. Melissa has an MBA in transportation from the Northwestern University and a BSc in finance from the University of California at Berkeley. She served as Assistant Chair of Technology for the US National Petroleum Council study, Advancing Technology for America's Transportation Future. And she is also chair of the Energy Institute's Electricity Board, which will bring you Powering Net Zero in October later this year. So Melissa, it's lovely to see you. Over to you for today's event.
Thanks, Louise. I'm really pleased to be here today to chair this webinar on the work that we've done with the World Economic Forum, Accenture, Enel, Sempra, Hitachi ABB, and about 20 other companies to develop the system value framework that you'll hear about today. Today, the speakers will explain the framework and 3 examples of how we applied the framework in India, Europe, and the US. But before we kick off, just a few housekeeping details. Firstly, your microphones have been muted, and you're unable to use your cameras as well to reduce interference. We will have a QA session at the end, but you can submit your questions at any time during the speakers' presentations. You just need to navigate to the chat, type in the question, and send it to me. I will hold all the questions until the Q&A session. And then on the conference, it's going to be recorded and a link will be sent to you after the conference. And the webinar is not under Chatham House rules. It'll be recorded and hosted on the EI site. But before we kick off, I would like to just introduce some of our speakers, our two keynote speakers. So let me introduce you to Kristen Panarelli and Stephanie Jameson. Kristen is the head of the electricity industry at the World Economic Forum. She has 20 years of experience in government and energy-related private sector. Prior to joining the forum, she worked at AES Corporation, AES Solar, and SunEdison in strategy, acquisitions, project development, and financing. Stephanie Jameson is a Senior Managing Director at Accenture. She leads our utilities industry business. She's spent almost 30 years working in the utilities industry, helping clients with energy transition, growth strategies, and large-scale business transformation programs for some of the largest and most innovative utilities in North America and Europe. Kristen, Stephanie, let me hand over to you.
Hi, Melissa, thank you for that introduction. And I think we're going to have a few slides come up, and I'll begin the presentation. Great, thank you. So we're here to give you an overview of the system value framework. I want to give you a little bit of a background of how we got here. During the first wave of the pandemic earlier this year, we had a dialogue amongst the electricity industry CEOs who are partners of the World Economic Forum to discuss what are the possible actions and what is the response that we can take as a collective, as an industry. And Henrik Anderson, who is the CEO of Vestas and the chair of our community, shared some of his thoughts on the value that clean energy transition can deliver to society. And from there, we began to build out. And along with a global group of CEOs and their companies, the conversation began to evolve to a narrative on how to shift industry thinking from cost to value. We needed a partner to help create a stronger narrative that was backed by analysis, and that's where Accenture came on to support, and we started working with Melissa and with Stephanie and their teams. And together we conducted dozens of interviews to develop the system value framework and to identify recovery solutions, which vary across different markets. Stephanie, I will hand the floor to you to share some more details on the framework.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. And let's go on to the next slide. Okay, hi everyone. What you see in front of you is what we call the system value framework. We created the framework to guide energy transition investment decisions. The framework, as you can see in front of you, has 12 dimensions. Each one of those hexagons or dimensions represents an outcome, a desired outcome of the energy system. And if you look at just a few of these, you can see greenhouse gas emissions are represented, jobs and economic impact, and some other dimensions here. And quickly you'll notice that it's quite a flexible framework because not all of these desired outcomes are relevant for every market. As part of this work, we built this framework to guide the decisions, and we needed a global framework and one that was comprehensive, that included cost, but not just cost. So that's how we ended up with this framework. We applied it to 5 markets, and behind this framework that you see, there is analysis, a bottom-up analysis for every one of the 5 major markets. We prioritized the desired outcomes and the solutions for each of those markets, and there are models, lots of detailed analysis behind each and every one of these dimensions, so that we could explain in every market which solutions were a priority and what the outcomes through those solutions would be achieved in terms of benefits. The greenhouse gas emission reduction for transmission extension in the US, that's just one example. But later on in the discussion, you heard that we will have representatives from Hitachi ABB, Enel, and Sempra Energy, based in California, who will all bring this framework to life from their own perspectives and their own markets. So the framework, it's been used in a number of settings. We rolled it out officially in October. It's been used in a number of settings. You'll hear from the 3 others joining about how it's used in their individual companies and markets. But Kristen, I think given the interactions that you have with the vast range of electricity partners that you interact with, I think you're best positioned to just give a broad view of all of the uses that we've seen since we deployed this. So would you mind just going through that with the group?
Sure, thanks. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the framework can be used in multiple ways. Our business partners, who you will hear from very shortly, have been using it to, first of all, evaluate investment decisions, to have conversations with their investors so that they can bring investors along on how to think about value. But it's also a great tool and a common language that can be used for business and for policymakers in order to work together to demonstrate value to society of different policies. And we're starting to introduce it to policymakers more and more as well, so that they can use it as something that can help them develop their policies and be able to demonstrate the broader value. And of course, this is a great framework just to simply anchor global dialogues on the next steps of the energy transition. We have already been deploying it in country level energy transition roundtables around the world, and will continue to do so. So Stephanie, I'm going to hand the floor back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. As you heard from Kristen when she explained the work that we did, our main goal through all of this work over the past several months was to identify solutions, energy solutions that would accelerate the energy transition in various markets and create jobs to aid with the economic recovery. So we built the framework, but we had to establish some decision criteria, and that's what you see in front of you here. The 3 criteria we used were solutions that accelerate the energy transition, solutions that accelerate the energy transition and create the maximum number of jobs over a set period of time. And finally, we had to choose solutions that were actually quantifiable. So we had to get to a level of detail that we could actually quantify and measure the benefits of each of those solutions. So those were our guiding principles that we used throughout the course of this whole project. I'm going to now turn it over to the 3 World Economic Forum partners who agreed to join us here and talk about their own perspectives and how they're using this. So I'll introduce the 3, and then we will listen to them talk about their own experiences. So first is Harmeet Bawa. Harmeet is the Global Head of Government and Institutional Relations for Hitachi ABB. Harmeet joined ABB Group more than 30 years ago and has served across a range of functions, including market and business development, corporate strategy, investor relations, and communications. He has worked and lived in the UK, Sweden, India, and South Asia, and today he is based in Switzerland. Francesca Gostinelli is also with us. She is the Head of Strategy, Economics, and Scenario Planning for Enel. Francesca's career has focused on energy and environment. She has covered positions such as the Head of Business Development and the Head of Regulation. Francesca has been a board member in various organizations, including Enel Green Power and Endesa Chile. Also, Lisa Alexander, the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and the Chief Sustainability Officer from Sempra Energy, has joined us. Previously, Lisa has been responsible for market strategy, clean transportation, energy efficiency, research and development, and environmental policy. Before joining Sempra Energy, Melissa worked as a partner in a management consulting firm where she advised North America utilities on smart grid and demand response. So please join me in listening into the stories coming from the US, Europe, and India about how this framework has been applied and how each of these individuals is using this framework in their company. Harmeet, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for the introduction. So in the next few minutes, what I would like to share with you is the exciting story from the Indian perspective. But before diving into the details here, what I would like to highlight is that of all the geographies that we were involved in studying, India possibly as a geography, perhaps more than any other, checked almost every single one of those hexagons on the box. System value framework, honeycomb diagram that you saw earlier. Whether it is areas like air quality and health, or water, or FDI, and of course the critical area of access to electricity. So this clearly highlights the case for a holistic approach to the clean energy transition, factoring in the economic, the environmental, the societal, and the energy value. Now, of course, as you all know, India with a 1.3 billion population and growing still fairly fast at a rapid clip, is using electricity as the backbone in terms of its massive energy needs to power this growth. But at the same time, despite the aggressive efforts of the government in the last few years, nearly 200 million people, depending on how we define it, are still lacking, in a way, grid connectivity. So access to electricity is still a topic, which is, of course, playing out at the same time as the clean energy transition. In total, India has an installed capacity of about 370 gigawatts. Quite a large part of that has been added in the last decade, but the generation mix is still very much dominated by coal at around 70%. And of course, this is changing steadily with renewables catching up fairly fast. So decarbonization being a focus of the government, it is in fact highlighted that in recent IEA reports that in 2021, India and Europe will perhaps be the front runners when it comes to new renewables being added. In fact, India already has, in a way, the fourth largest installed capacity on renewables in the world at 136 gigawatts, including hydro, which is not far from its target that they set a few years ago of 175 gigawatts by 2022, aiming for 450 by 2030. And 40% of the power is expected to come from non-fossil sources by 2030. Now, of course, solar is a big push for India, given obviously the geographic and the climatic conditions, both bulk and distributed. And they've already gone from 11 megawatts of solar in 2010 to about 35 gigawatts now. And they're aiming to scale it up quite dramatically. In fact, solar and wind together expected to double by 2025 from 9% in 2019 to about 18% by 2025. So, but the main thing is that, you know, we talk a lot about the energy mix and the power generation side. It's equally important to keep in mind that we think beyond power generation, and considerable attention is also required on the transmission grid, not just in order to accommodate additional capacity and relieve grid congestion, but also in order to make the grid more resilient and flexible, which will be required with all this influx. As far as other characteristics are concerned, there are a lot of distribution losses from a financial perspective, which are being targeted through privatization to reduce the debt of the distribution sector and make it more viable. Similarly, if you look from the demand side dynamics, the addition of electric mobility and other new demand loads will also require the grid to become more adapted for the new realities. So considering the new demand and supply side complexities into the system, it definitely needs to become not just stronger and smarter, even as it becomes greener. Slide 2, please. This chart basically outlines 5 key solution areas that can help to accelerate the energy transition. And this is something that we put together as part of the system value framework development. And these will also help to catalyze the decarbonization journey, which India has committed to, including signing up on the Paris Accord. Of course, like any other such exercise, is not an exhaustive list, but these are areas that can have a major impact and need attention. And highlighted below in the boxes, the blue boxes, basically the estimate for lowering carbon footprint, the job creation potential, and possible human health benefits from air quality improvements in dollar terms. So the first of these is basically renewable zones in terms of the renewable energy zones, or REZs. Basically, this is developing a geographic area characterized by several features that support cost-effective renewable energy development, including high-quality renewable resources, the right topography, and strong developer interest. So in addition to removing investment impediments, such as land acquisition concerns, an REZ basically allows the system planners to overcome difference in timescales, et cetera, and really get things moving. The second one, of course, is the distributed solar area, which is a lot talked about because in India, there's a lot of discussion around rooftop solar in households and so on and so forth. And this, from a technology point of view, requires the development of grid edge solutions in order to give us a significant boost from the distributed side, in addition to the grid scale additions that we do. Now, here again, I think it's important to see that the right mix of public-private partnerships and KPI-based incentives can result in a 30% increase on the base case in capacity. The transmission investment, as mentioned earlier, will be critical, which is the third element, to fulfill the overall vision. And amongst other structural issues to address here, keep in mind that India still has T&D losses estimated at 20% nearly, which is double the global average. So in addition to addressing capacity and T&D losses, I think power quality issues and outages, etc., cannot be taken lightly in this geography. There's also significant scope for energy efficiency, whether it's cutting down the losses or applying it in buildings, transportation, industry, or even households. And as they say, the greenest energy is the energy saved. The next item here is coal plant closures. And what we're talking about here is accelerating the retirement of sites which are no longer viable either financially or operationally as an incremental benefit to those plant closures that were already on the anvil. So here again, if I request the next slide, please. So this chart here is a waterfall chart showing emissions reduction from recovery scenarios, referring to CO2 savings in the year 2025. And as you can have a look here, I mean, the emissions in this case, by the way, refer to the power sector only. And the expected increase in column 2 basically refers to the business as usual figures as represented by recent BNEF or Bloomberg New Energy Finance study. And despite the ambitious reduction, as you see, as a result of the WEF recovery scenarios, there is still a long way to go for India in order to reduce emissions, as demonstrated by the last column, which is the residual 2025 figure. So it's quite clear that even with the deployment of all these special initiatives, there is still a lot of work to be done. So just to kind of bring the summary on some of the main points, I think electricity, just to reiterate, will be the backbone of India's energy transition acceleration, just as it will be in most other parts of the world. Financing will be a critical factor. And I think it's very important to make a couple of points here to make sure that we look beyond CapEx to TOTEX in terms of bringing in the OpEx angle and factoring in elements like social environmental benefits that we're talking about here in the system value framework. And again, since impact of ton, if you really think about it, a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2 in terms of the impact on the global climate. And therefore, we must keep in mind that a dollar spent in some of these emerging markets can go much further than the dollar we spend, let's say, in Europe and some of the mature markets. And it's absolutely imperative that we actually take a holistic view. So the final statement I would like to make is that collaboration will be the most critical factor in terms of success, whether that is collaboration across stakeholder groups, be it technology providers, utilities, be it consumers, be it policymakers, be it regulators, etc., but also across geographies. And of course, as we all know, I mean, the whole climate change and now the climate transition ambition is basically, you know, a global problem. So a global problem needs a global solution. So thank you very much. And I would like to now pass on to Francesca.
Hello, thank you, Armit, and thanks to Stephanie as well for the introduction. Good afternoon. So coming to Europe, what we've been discovering lately is Europe is under a very important boost on green economy, and the start of the Green Deal that was launched more than 1 year ago has been encouraging a lot of discussion and action, most likely on green economy. What do we intend with green economy in Europe? Basically, Europe wants to be carbon neutral by 2050. And the main three aims are to create a Europe which is greener, more digital, more resilient, and better fit for the next challenges ahead. During the pandemic, of course, all member states have been put at a serious pressure, as many countries in the world. But notwithstanding that, ambitions that were set before the pandemic came in and broke through has been even more strengthened. So basically, what have been decided the most lately is that from an initial target of cutting greenhouse gases emissions by 40%, the European Union is now committing to cut the 55%, which is a steep increase. But a steep increase is necessary because we all know that to get to a more resilient, climate resilient world in the future, as the IPCC is commenting, we need to stay around to 1.5 degrees global temperature on average, higher than the pre-industrial limits. And frankly speaking, this is a challenge for everybody, and we think that the system value here is just posing a lot of attention in getting everyone to have a clear role and support for reaching these global objectives. You know that in the European Union, each member state then is committed to develop and define its national energy and climate plan. This is what will happen in next semester to get to the 55% cut, as I mentioned before. And basically for the climate and energy goals, also other goals which are related to the fight against climate change and to the decarbonization are going to be met. For example, the package includes a target of 32 share of renewable energy on final energy consumption, which is going to be increased up to 30-40 according to the new challenges and new targets. And we have also the energy efficiency percentage that was in the first stage put set at 32.5. Now is going to be pushed a little bit forward on final energy savings up to 36-37%. All of these measures, of course, require a lot of change, a lot of investments. The wind for change, anyhow, is there. And the European Commission set up a new fund, which is called the Next Generation EU, for a total of 750 billion euro, which is anyhow in line with the climate neutral objective that should be reached by 2050. And most of these potential measures implies, for example, the steep increase in renewable capacity, where wind and solar, both onshore and offshore, will have a lot of additional gigawatts in all countries, and a new wave of development around the hydrogen, which is set. This is not an official goal, but this is an aspirational goal to have up to 40 gigawatt capacity for electrolyzer by 2030. So in general, you see that the split in greenhouse gases emissions is very much given by every sector. So transport, for example, energy industries are very much responsible for, and fuel combustion for the energy sector, for greenhouse gases. So it's mandatory that every sector is finding the best and the most effective measures to tackle this goal. As per today, one data that I can give you to stick ideas into our mind is that the electricity mix today is made approximately by 1/3 renewables, 2/3 thermal and nuke, and in 2030, with the new ambition, the percentage will be reversed. So we will have 2/3 of renewables and 1/3 of thermal plus nuke. Arush, we can go to the next chart, please. So applying the system value that has been developed by Accenture to the Europe which kind of messages we were focusing on. First of all, we divided the intervention in 3 main categories. The first category is connected cities and electrification. Why this come first? This come first because basically we have around the 60% of CO2 coming from cities, from whatever activities, households, commercials, small and medium enterprises, transportations, and so on and so forth. So ideally, if we invest in initiatives, both in the building sector and in the transportation sector, trying to push the use of renewables also at a residential level, so more distributed energy resources. If we try to couple sectors and try to find cross-sectors efficiency, if we make buildings more efficient and more electrified, and finally, if we try to electrify as much as we can transportation, of course we get to lower pollution and we get to more interconnected cities, more flexible, where final customers can have their role and can support the management of grids in a more sustainable, allowing more renewables to be in, and more efficient way. So all these potential intervention will lead to a saving of higher than 260 million tons CO2 and potentially created 680,000 jobs. Hand in hand also with savings in the health system for 36 billion of health benefits that have been calculated. The second cluster is renewables, power markets, and networks of the future, which of course is not detached from the first cluster. What we're saying here is that if we imagine a world made of higher than 70% renewables, these renewables must be managed on the grid. And to be managed on the grid, we need more investments on networks, because they have to be more resilient, more digitalized, more flexible and adaptive to a completely different system. We have to have market rules that can follow this and can rule these better, because simply is a completely different system. And we have then to adapt infrastructure overall, so have a lot of investments to get to the network of the future, which are the backbone of all what we're trying to achieve. So pushing all these interventions together will lead to a saving of 170 million tons CO2 and health benefits for 43 billion. Again, this is linked with decarbonization, which is linked to electrification, because we can afford a source of energy which is cleaner than it was in the past. And then the list was the hydrogen economy. You see here that it's pinned up to 2050, because hydrogen is, we can say that is pioneering, is under development. And to build a green hydrogen market and infrastructure with cost-effective, but for hard to abate sector and transportation as well. And basically, we found out that in Europe we have 3,000 industrial clusters representing 54 million jobs, which is an astonishing number. And helping these sectors decarbonize is of course key, because as we saw in the previous chart, the emission of greenhouse gases linked to this sector are very high. Hydrogen could create up to 900,000 new jobs with a very relevant savings of more than 500 million tons of CO2 in the future. So next chart, please. If we go to the final balance on CO2, what has been calculated here is that Europe has done already a pretty good job in the past to cut by 25% the emissions of greenhouse gases in 2018. What is missing now is to go from 4 point something to 2 point something in the year 2030. So applying the scenario that NEF Bloomberg New Energy Finance has developed, plus all the additional intervention that we've been calculated in, apparently there's still a lack of around 600,000 CO2 to be searched for. But I would like in the next chart to give a sort of positive and optimistic message, because basically this cut of 55%, according to a study that has been developed by Enerdata and FTI, is reachable, is feasible, because if you calculate the decarbonization curve up to 2050, so going to zero, basically net zero, and you assume that the costs of technologies will be lowering and lowering, and the system efficiency will be achieved year after year, the 55% in 2030 might be achieved, and this will lead us at speed up to a net zero in 2050. To do so, I repeat a little bit what Armit was saying. Cooperation among sector, decision must be undertaken, having in mind that it is a common goal. So go to net zero is an effort that is not doable by just a specific sector or just some companies. It is a public effort, an effort that must be shared, and that should represent a priority for everyone. So it's really important to understand the consequences and the benefits according to the system value of all what we try to do in terms of new investments and new engagement. And then I would like to leave the floor to Lisa for introducing US.
Thank you, Francesca. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So first, for context, Sempra Energy owns and operates energy infrastructure in North America. Our businesses serve more consumers than any other utility company in the US, over 35 million. We serve the largest economies in North America and also in the world. California is the 5th largest economy globally by GDP, also Texas and Mexico. So our businesses include the US's largest natural gas distribution utility, Texas's largest electric T&D company, one of North America's most significant LNG export portfolios, and also renewables and other diversified energy infrastructure in Mexico. So our roots are in the California regulated utility businesses. Over 150 years, we've operated by ESG principles before ESG was even a term. So we run our businesses with a multi-stakeholder perspective, and our investments are informed by multiple factors: shareholder return, community benefits, emissions, resilience, to name a few. So for us, the system value framework codifies how we've been able to thrive over the decades in serving the holistic needs of our customers, and couldn't be more pleased for us to be having this conversation today. So turning to our current context, just yesterday, the Biden administration announced its intention to rejoin the Paris Agreement, which is a critical step forward for energy transition opportunities in our country. The administration's clean energy and infrastructure proposal calls for $2 trillion of investment over the next 4 years, creating 1.25 million jobs. So there's remarkable potential here in the coming 4 or 5 years. There's a real congruence between investment opportunities with a view towards lowering emissions while also advancing job creation, reliability, security, and affordability for our customers. So in the US, a quick note is that our energy system largely runs on a local, state, or regional basis. But as we've previously seen with the American Recovery Act about 10 years ago, the federal government has some really essential levers to inspire innovation and incentivize progress. So second, significant upgrades to the existing energy infrastructure, primarily T&D, but also behind the meter and security, will be needed to ensure a modern energy grid, one that's able to accommodate increasing amounts of renewables while maintaining reliability. So WoodMac recently estimated that $4.5 trillion in investments in the US would be required over the next 10 years to achieve this modern energy grid. And it's not just electric systems, but it's also natural gas as well, both displacing dirtier forms of generation and also evolving to incorporate hydrogen. So in the coming years, we imagine integrated energy systems where molecules and electrons work in concert to deliver resilience and lowest emissions. And that's largely reflective of some of Francesca's comments about Europe's aspirations as well. And finally on this slide, given the scale of change we anticipate, prioritization is really key. So as you see from the chart here, transportation accounts for the largest portion, almost 1/3 of total US greenhouse gas emissions, and that was in 2018. So a concerted effort is needed to develop infrastructure to support aggressive clean transportation goals. In California, you may have heard, we operate 2 leading utilities there, and Governor Gavin Newsom a couple months ago set a goal for the sales of all new passenger vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035. So we're actively investing in bringing this vision to life through EV charging infrastructure, clean natural gas for long-haul trucking, and more. Moving to the next slide, please. So applying the system value framework to the US as we look out to 2025, 4 recovery solutions have really risen to the top. These fall across the energy value chain and also increase progress on the energy transition while improving resilience. So first, renewables expansion. Proposed multi-year extensions of the ITC, the investment tax credit, and PTC could increase solar capacity by 25% and onshore wind by 14% over 2025 base case projections, with additional process and infrastructure support able to expand the nascent offshore wind industry. And here in the US, it truly is nascent. A total of 66 gigawatts of additional wind and solar capacity could lower electricity sector emissions by 300 tons through 2025 and support 250,000 economy-wide jobs by then as well. And of course, we can't talk about renewables opportunity without addressing intermittency and storage. So California serves as an example here. The US Energy Information Administration notes that both demand for electricity and output from natural gas power plants in California are often the highest from 4 to 7 p.m. after solar power, which is what largely powers California, has plateaued and has begun to decline as the sun sets. Our businesses experience this every day. And what we know from this is that natural gas is a natural partner to renewables. It provides essential multi-hour and seasonal storage with additional future potential through power to gas technology and hydrogen. So simply put, if you love renewables, you need to at least like natural gas infrastructure to support both resilience and lowest carbon emissions over time. Second, greater investment towards transmission and improved planning and collaboration have the potential to significantly alleviate congestion and drive more renewable capacity. So Texas is a great example. Texas's successful transition to cleaner energy was facilitated by the CREZ plan, which was implemented by the Texas legislature. It's the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone Plan. This was an effort to connect electricity generated by wind and other renewables to population centers in the central and east part of the state. During this time, Sempra Energy's Encore built and continues to operate more than 1,000 miles of these transmission lines, more than 1/3 of the total state, and has consistently supported generators who are investing in bringing cleaner energy sources to customers in their electricity zone. So thanks to this, wind power has just overtaken coal in Texas's electricity mix. On any given day, you'll see more renewables flowing through Texas than you might in California. And renewable capacity is truly surging in America's heartland as a result. So looking out to 2025, increased investment in transmission in the US has the potential to grow that wind capacity by 11%, about 18 gigawatts, and solar by a smaller amount, about 2% or 3 gigawatts. So this could lower electricity sector emissions by over 120 tons million tons through 2025 and support several tens of thousands of economy-wide jobs. So third, energy efficiency remains some of the quickest potential ways to spur job growth. There is still more to do. There is still low-hanging fruit. So replicating the investment levels of the 2009 US Recovery Act into smart efficiency solutions could immediately support over 500,000 workers to implement smart building and energy infrastructure. And that also results in keeping costs low for consumers. They're simply using less energy while also lowering emissions through 2025. And then finally in the US, as we see variable renewables increase, there's a greater need for flexibility and matching of low carbon generation mix with load profiles. So increased electrification and digitalization of buildings and transportation can boost system flexibility and reliability while cutting emissions through solutions like batteries, electric vehicles, heat pumps, as well as power to gas and in the future, hydrogen storage. I should note that electrification is one of the many paths that can be taken to a lower carbon future. So we believe we need to embrace an all of the above approach to reduce emissions across our sector and society. And the system value framework really provides us a great lens to consider those trade-offs and understand what's optimal. So moving to the next slide. In its 2020 World Energy Outlook, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, noted that the largest reduction in man-made GHG emissions over the last 20 years was in the US. And that was down almost 1 gigaton from the 2000 peak. And that happened as we moved away from coal to cleaner burning natural gas generation and also invested more heavily in renewables. So this was marked progress over the last 2 decades. But as this chart shows, more progress certainly is needed to achieve a 2035 net zero aspiration. So as noted here, we have a good sense for the path as to the steps the country can take in the near term to reduce emissions. And you see those laid out right there. But what we know is that climate is a global issue. So the air in China today will be in California by Saturday. Globally and in the longer term, we also expect that hydrogen and US LNG exports to countries that currently rely on much dirtier forms of fuel for electric generation will play significant roles towards addressing global climate change. So in closing, overcoming the interrelated challenges associated with climate change, energy access, economic recovery, and resilience requires a real rejection of divisive ideologies and rather an embracing of a global perspective and a system or network view of energy. So we believe that the system value framework can offer a real helpful lens for policymakers to assess the best path forward. So thank you very much, and I'll now pass it to Melissa Stark with Accenture.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. So you also heard from 3 different speakers talking about 3 very different markets, all using the system value framework. So India with its coal and its grid and losses challenges. Europe with a very aggressive set of targets to get to a 55% reduction by 2030. And then the US, who's using gas to actually grow its renewables. And actually in some states, like Texas, people don't realize, have so much renewables. I think the largest actual capacity installed, and I think over 20% of its generation is just wind. And if you add solar to that, then you get somewhere between 20 and 30 of its electricity. California, we always know, but I think people are surprised. And even SPP, the middle of the country, I think is somewhere almost 30%. So 3 very different markets, and they all used the system value framework to look at what solutions would deliver the most important outcomes for those markets. One other thing that came out of the work that we weren't expecting to come out of it was this, which is the path to maximizing system value. When we came up with the system value framework, as Kristen and Stephanie said, the objective was to come up with a way to look at value beyond cost, to look at societal value, so just transition, environmental, CO2, air quality, health, economics, so still maintaining competitiveness, but also the energy value. So both Lisa and Francesca talked about a very different system, an integrated energy system, a variable system. So it needed to have characteristics like flexibility and energy productivity and systemic efficiency in that framework as well. So it was that framework, testing it in the markets, that's what we sought to achieve. But what we also got out of it was this path. We didn't expect 5 different markets. The other 2 markets we looked at were China and Brazil. When we looked at the solutions and the sequence of the solutions and the outcomes and the maturity of the markets, what came up with was actually a sequence of things that you should do in order, depending on how much wind and solar you really have in your system. So for markets with very little wind and solar, let's say less than 10%, then you're looking at still, investing in the core, which is expanding renewables, doing as much as you can with energy efficiency, and then upgrading the grid and maximizing interconnections, which is what we've done in the European continent. It's been interconnections in hydropower that's helped to grow renewables. So you can't really go wrong with that as a first investment, and you need to continue to invest in those things. But when a market hits something like 20 to 30% variable, so that's not renewables because hydro is renewables, it's variable, so wind and solar, you end up having to move to a variable system because at that percentage, the grid will be running on north of 50% wind or solar some of the time, right? And at an annual electricity of 20 to 30% wind and solar, there's an instantaneous amount of time in the high wind season or in the peak sun where your grid will be majority variable, which then means you are looking at a very different system, and you need to start looking at a market reform to match that system, a much more flexible grid, much more digital flexibility using demand, so that demand is also following supply, and we're using the energy when there's the most renewables. And then moving on to what Lisa was saying is into an integrated energy system. We actually need to start using everything. When you get to certain those levels, which, California and Texas, where she is, they're already there, then you really need to start looking at those molecules and electrons acting in tandem into an integrated energy system. So this path emerged. And I think this is probably the last thing that we want to share with you before we move to the Q&A. So with that, what I want to do now is ask all the speakers to turn on their videos and their microphones, and we can move to the Q&A part of our session. Great. Okay, so my first question is actually going to go to Harmeet, Lisa, and Francesca. And it is, how are your organizations using the system value framework? And Francesca, would you kick us off?
Thank you, Melissa. So there are 2 main features that I would like to tell. The first one is that we have a business strategy and a corporate strategy which is entirely centralized on sustainability. So this has allowed us to project a sort of 100 investment for the next 10 years as a company. So this is what we have been announcing to the markets in November. And this huge amount of investments will be for more than 90% addressed by the Sustainable Development Goals. That means that we are trying to cope through these investments the part of the goals of the Agenda 2030. And this has been basically what we do with this money. This is what we discussed already. We are keen on developing renewables. We have a green hydrogen plan. We would like to reinforce our grid. So we have more than 74 million end users worldwide. So globally, we have lots of distribution networks in operation. And we would like to invest in flexibility services, commodity and beyond commodity services for the customers. Customers are cities, customers are consumers, customers are industries. And we are trying to apply, for example, models of circularity, both for industrial customers and cities as well. On another hand, what we did practically on the system value per se was developing a model, which is a dynamical model, the one that is used for impact assessment also in some multilateral institutions, and try to couple the economic and social value of each single investment with additional KPIs like CO2 avoided, like circularity. So this model is basically taking CapEx and OpEx of each single investment and try to give a wider view of the consequences, the benefits that the project will have at local level. This is helping a lot in understanding what we are really providing the communities we live in with and overall stakeholders. So it goes hand in hand with the development of the stakeholder capitalism that we are now as a community trying to address better and better.
Great, thanks, Francesca. Lisa, do you want to talk about how Sempra is using the framework?
Yeah, so I think similar to Francesca's company, Sempra, as I noted, has been viewing investments and our strategies always through a multi-stakeholder perspective. What the framework gives us is a codified way of thinking about that. And we've been investing significant time over the last several months meeting with policymakers. As I noted earlier in my presentation, we expect there's going to be great potential for the U.S. to do more in advancing the energy transition. So as we think about how to achieve that, particularly as we seek to recover from COVID and those economic impacts, our view is that the system value framework provides a way to think from multiple lenses. So climate's a driver, jobs are a driver, resilience is a driver. So we've been working with some of our trade associations and also meeting directly with policymakers to help bring that integrated perspective to inform their thinking as we all move forward on an infrastructure plan and future energy policies in the country.
Great. Harmeet?
Yeah, thanks. Just to kind of back up on what Lisa and Francesca said, as a quick introduction, of course, Hitachi ABB Power Grids is a technology provider. And, we've been at it for more than 130 years. And we have a lot of critical technologies, including those which we kind of innovated, like HVDC, et cetera, which are now really coming to the fore in terms of integrating renewables, taking the transmission chain through, and then delivering the last mile connect. Now, the interesting thing here with the system value framework for us was that it's a structured approach, which, as I said already, for us as a company that operates in 100 countries, we can deploy across borders. So at the end of the day, while there may be some which are more relevant to the others, but I use the case of India where it almost checks all the boxes. And so what we're doing is that we are actually using this framework. First and foremost, we are making sure that we are taking it deeper into the organization. So all the way from senior management right down to our marketing and sales people, et cetera, that people are aware of it. And it's basically a good reference point in terms of how to take it forward. It's also a very opportune time because it's being highlighted now that the grid could be a bottleneck. It's all very well about all these huge amounts of renewables and new demand side challenges, but the complexities will eventually come to roost if we don't develop the grid. We can have a whole lot of offshore wind farms and the power has nowhere to go. So I think there is a clear realization on that. And so with this system value framework, it's really about accentuating the point that the technologies that are required to facilitate the acceleration of the energy transition are mostly there. It's not that, you know, we are missing the holy grail here or whatever, and it's really going to be a case of how fast and how effectively we can deploy these. And the interesting thing with this framework is that when you address policymakers or financiers and those kind of external stakeholder groups, you can make the point, for example, to policymakers that you have many more benefits. And I think post-COVID, the realization is even more that they can also get economic benefits, social benefits, create jobs, and so on and so forth. And this has to be factored in to the equation. Otherwise, you know, the whole picture just won't make sense. So for us, it's an extremely useful tool, which we actually use not just for discussions, but also for the value proposition that we try to kind of put across.
That's great. And I know, Stephanie, you've been talking to clients. Would you like to add your perspective?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, as you said, a number of the utilities that we work with, we've taken the framework to, these are companies that in some cases are partners with the World Economic Forum and others are not. And all of the uses that Kristen lined out earlier in her presentation, as well as what we heard from Harmeet, Lisa, and Francesca, are really relevant globally. And because the framework is so flexible in that some of those outcomes are relevant to a market and some aren't, it can be used for any type of discussion internally or externally. So all of the things that I'm seeing in the way that we are using it, that Accenture people are using it with our utility clients, really came to life by the group here.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And Kristen, I know you're really the big leader, like the big group leader of this whole group. I know that you're using the framework in some of the other areas in the forum. Do you want to wrap up, close out this question?
Sure. Yeah, there have been just so many net zero announcements over the past year from nations, from cities, and from business. And our goal is really to continue to share this framework as a tool that can serve as a common narrative that can help guide the transition. Particularly, we're looking at cities as an ecosystem for demand and at industrial clusters. And how can this framework be used as sort of a North Star so that the decisions can be made in a way that we're not only addressing the environment, but we're also addressing economic recovery, the creation of jobs, building more resilience in the system, etc.
Great,
Thanks.
great. And the framework really is designed to help navigate towards the energy transition to net zero. And so I'm going to move to one of the first questions. We have a question here. While the framework itself is excellent, it feels like it's being primarily used to identify electricity-based solutions. And we know we're using it broader than that. So I want you guys all to react. Develop it in developed economies, heating and cooling is a key challenge. And then in developing countries, biomass and waste are also important. So I would like the group to maybe to answer it from different perspectives. I think, Kristen, your perspective, and then Lisa, of course, for Sempra, it's being used for more than just electricity. Harmeet from the developing angle, and Nell, you're in a lot of developed markets as well. Stephanie with the growth market. So if you all want to take a crack at this, I'm okay with who goes first. Kristen, you're up already. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I just that the criteria that we used to select the solutions were those that Stephanie had presented, and one of the key criteria was solutions are really focused on what's easy to deploy right now and the technologies that are available right now. So that provides a lot of the context for those solutions that were selected.
Great. And Lisa, do you want to comment on the question around the framework and electricity versus other technologies?
Yeah, and I'll build on what Kristen said. I think it really is a question of timescale. So at Sempra, our companies have been leading on renewable natural gas. We have the nation's largest ag sector and also dairy sector here in the state. SoCalGas, which is the country's largest gas distribution utility, has voluntarily already committed to a goal of 5% RNG by 2022 and 20% by 2030. And that's an effort that we're really driving. We're also looking at hydrogen. We have a portfolio of over 10 hydrogen R&D projects, and those run the gamut from looking at how we can increase the flow of hydrogen in our system in a way that's safe and resilient. And also we've announced that we'll be implementing 2 power to gas projects in the San Diego area in the coming few years. So we certainly expect that those projects, number one, the factors, but it really is a question of time frame as to when we'll see them arrive at maturity. And since the time frame here was 2025 for the purpose of this initial analysis, that's why you're not seeing those as broad solutions. But I'll close my remarks on this question just by noting that, as I said, and as Melissa and Francesca alluded to, future energy systems will require a combination of molecules and electrons. So it isn't only electricity. There is a huge opportunity for hydrogen, renewable gas, and conventional gas going forward, particularly as we look at supporting developing economies. And I think that's really where we're going to see natural gas play a very significant role. So as we look ahead, the framework, I think, extended into that time frame certainly will support strategies like that. And Sempra itself as a company does as well.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Harmeet, do you want to comment?
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of points to bring out with sort of real reference examples. I'm on certain other working groups where we are looking at the whole topic of financing of energy transition related projects that could kind of accelerate energy transition projects, regardless of whether they are in the electricity sector or not. And of course, as I mentioned before, it is a challenge when it comes to developing or emerging economies in terms of attracting that finance. So again, in some of these forums, I mean, I have actually brought this framework into play, because when we are actually talking to the different financing mechanisms, or whether it's the MDBs or the other financing mechanisms and so on and so forth, I think it's extremely important that they take a holistic view on it. So, I mean, when you're talking about something like that, the model is as appropriate as anything, whether it is electricity or not. The second important point that I want to make is that we're seeing more and more as a technology provider, the push towards sector integration, or what used to be called sector coupling. So at the end of the day, the sector, let's say, is coupling with, let's say, mobility or with hydrogen and so on and so forth. I think it's quite clear that for the energy transition to accelerate and for us to achieve these ambitious decarbonization goals and what's needed, we will need everything. We will have to throw everything at it. So, of course, we do see that electricity will be the backbone of this energy transition, but I think everything else will be required as well. And so, Lisa made the point, and earlier Francesca talked about hydrogen. So I think there are, of course, for example, the heat example that was used. Yes, of course, there are countries that are already looking into the sector integration and how to bring heat into the overall discussion, because it is another big, huge consumption of electricity. Or it could be, in some countries, the huge energy efficiency potential from things like air conditioners and so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot to be gained here in terms of trying to see how to deploy the model.
Great, thanks, Harmeet. Francesca, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I think that the model in general is very holistic, as Lisa was saying. So basically, you can evaluate whatever new investments are to different parameters, and these KPIs are not really related only to electricity, because I mean, water saved, CO2 emissions are really wide. So I important, and I'm representing Enel, which is a global player in electricity and power generation, distribution, and so on and so forth. So we really believe that electrification is helping a lot in decarbonizing, because of renewables are what they are. So I think this is true for in general, but single countries have single economic structure. Not all the countries have the same economic structure, so the impacts on each country are very different according to what you would like to do. They don't have the same resources, so they must have a totally different cost benefit. But the only thing we have to think of is that the reduction in CO2 and the climate goals are a global goal. So that's a priority. And according to that, after evaluation, for sure, the most ready, or then the technologies that must be supported because they are the most effective in the system value framework will have their possibilities to emerge.
Great, thanks, Francesca. And Stephanie, in the clusters work, that is where we are seeing things like heating, cooling, waste, systemic efficiency, reuse, some of the things here. I think applying the system value in the industrial clusters analysis that we're doing now will yield, actually, because you'll do it at a micro level, more of this. But could you add some thoughts on the industrial clusters work and how that might bring out kind of like smaller, more nascent solutions, but that fit a context, right? That might make some more sense in a context.
Yeah, I think the main point that others made, and that I will just reinforce, is that if we change the, today we presented analysis that had a certain term to it, a very short term. That's something that could be, solutions that are shovel ready, that could accelerate the energy transition and create jobs over the next 5 years, and in some cases 10. But if we change the term, we would change the solutions. Other solutions would pop in. And to your point, Melissa, about industrial clusters, those grouping of industries, and there's a big focus on decarbonizing or reducing emissions or removing emissions in industrial clusters here in the UK and all over the world. And applying this framework to those clusters would show you the path to net zero that you spoke about. Those solutions that showed up in the second phase, the third phase, beyond electrification, all those solutions will come into the industrial cluster analysis when we apply the system value framework to it. And to your point, Melissa, we'll be releasing a paper on that in February and highlighting a number of solutions that are relevant to clusters. So thanks for the opportunity to comment on that.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. And Kristen, you mentioned the city's work before, kind of a similar pivot to this question. How are you planning to apply the system value framework to a city? And we've explained how we've applied it to a market level, but what is this thinking around applying it to cities?
Sure. It's actually really the goal of the program. It's really to accelerate the transition to a net zero carbon future while maximizing system value. So the whole program is designed around that. And the real vision is creating what we call systemic efficiency. And that's through optimizing energy at the intersections of the various different sectors that are in a city. So looking at how to bring together buildings with energy technology to make ultra efficient buildings, smart energy infrastructure, and clean electrification of end uses. Sorry, my kids in the background doing a class online. So clean electrification of end uses, whether it's the built living environment or whether we're talking about transportation. So looking at those solutions that were described by my fellow panelists, you could really see all of those different sectors coming together. And so it's really about looking at the city ecosystem as a demand center, and how to bring the different pieces together in order to have that story about climate, but also about job creation and improved air quality, particularly in places like India, as Harmeet was sharing with us, and bolstered resilience. All of these are really important factors when you look at cities and what the mayors care about, and what the national level governments care about as well. So really, how do you bring together, the local story with the national policies, as well as the business models, because all three of those really need to come together in order to accelerate that transition to net zero carbon future.
And I think the collaboration and the operating models of the different parties has been front and center and has been really coming out of the discussion. This is actually a comment to the folks that are asking the question. Someone said, point 2, I'm not sure which slide of which point and which speaker. So if you could just add a little bit more information in the chat, I will get back to that question. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question, which was a question about Europe, but I'm actually going to make it Europe and the US because I think the question applies to both. The question is, with Europe, let's say, with Europe asking all of the countries to define their own path to target, how are you going to guarantee Europe's path to an integrated energy system, as investments for wave 3 are expected to be huge and covered across country? And to be honest, the same thing for the states in the US, because it works the same way. So I know many of you are like global, like with Anel and Harmeet, you guys are global. Lisa, comment on the US. But that question, who wants to take it first?
Shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Francesca. Great, perfect, perfect.
So, I mean, that's for sure always an act of heavy negotiations. But what I can tell, being present ourselves in many countries in Europe, especially in Spain and Italy and Romania, but each country is really committed in reaching the goal. So in my opinion, there will be for sure additional effort, but I see all governments really acting as potential front runner. So I see a lot of energy in trying to get to this goal for their country in a consistent way. So if to be honest, I think that there was a lot of discussion on coal. You would remember that from newspapers. In Italy, for example, the government decided to stop coal in 2025. So, I mean, we've already dismissed a lot of coal, and we'll just 2027 in all countries. But I think it's I mean, the way people are feeling the goal is really impressive. So I see a lot of commitment. To be honest, I wouldn't be very much worried on the overall commitment of countries. There are some technological challenges, so we need to hurry up. There's no much time, so we all need to be quick.
Great.
And I'll note for the U.S. That, you know, until yesterday, we have, as a country, not had a goal. And now that we've rejoined Paris, that's the first step to setting a context that could help align all the jurisdictions that manage energy, which are thousands. As I noted, we have municipal energy companies, some that are run by counties or states, some that are run by regions. So it truly is a matter of herding cats. I think that one thing that, as I said, is key is having just general countrywide alignment around Paris and the aspirations there. But number 2 is the financial markets play a significant role, particularly for investor-owned energy companies and utilities, as well as for municipal ones that rely on bonds and other factors. We see the EU being pretty bold in some of its regulations related to investments going forward. And I think in the US, we're also experiencing rising investor attention to the long-term sustainability of enterprises, both on the debt and equity side. So I think that will help continue to be an organizing factor. And I think that has had influence in the last several years, even absent any national goal. So I guess that's my first thing is that the power of the financial markets, depending on what way they go in evaluating sustainability, is probably going to be a significant organizing factor going forward. The next thing that I'll just note is in my earlier comments, I noted that the federal government has a couple key levers to help accelerate innovation and progress. And those include renewable energy incentive programs, also significant research and development funding from our Department of Energy, as well as certain regulations from some of the executive branch agencies. So I think that we'll continue to see those agencies creating programs that will help pull everyone along. But I think it really will be a matter of herding cats with a number of stakeholders, helping all the various energy entities to move in that direction.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Harmeet, any comments on how we bring it all together?
Thanks a lot. Melissa, the point I want to make is actually, let me take Europe as an example, because that's, in the last, let's say, less than the last 30, 60 days, we've seen a lot of important policy announcements coming out. We saw the offshore wind plan coming out. We saw the 10E regulation coming out. We saw, for example, even in the sort of post-Brexit agreement in terms of where the UK stands on this topic. And now there is, of course, a clear realization that this has to be a collaborative effort, and that is starting to gain traction. From a technology provider point of view, let me tell you where this is basically taking us is that we are seeing much more discussion and, in terms of the topic of interconnections becoming far more relevant. The topic of developing an offshore grid becoming much more relevant, because obviously the whole focus has to be on maximizing renewable penetration. And, that's why the whole discussion around Europe becoming more interconnected is definitely now gaining traction, because otherwise you will not be able to compensate, for example, even the solar resources in the southern part and the wind in the north and so on and so forth. So I think technology will also play a key role. Fortunately, we have many of these technologies at hand, but it's going to need the policymakers and the regulators understanding the need and the urgency to be able to act fast enough in order for these things to be deployed. So that was one comment that I wanted to make on an optimistic note that, yes, while it is a challenge of herding cats, I think that's what partly the politicians have to do.
And Kristen, this is the goal of the forum, right? Public-private collaboration. So what are your thoughts on bringing everyone together? And I think that was one of the things that you mentioned with the framework, that it was like a mechanism to have a global dialogue. Do you want to comment?
Exactly. And that is the mission of the World Economic Forum. We are the public-private institution focused on improving the state of the world. And so we really believe that to solve these big challenges in the world, it requires a multi-stakeholder approach. And when I look at the challenges of that we've been talking about today, it does go beyond just one sector. When you're looking at a city, for example, this requires bringing together the real estate sector along with urban planners, along with the utilities and energy technology companies, mobility. It's really pulling everybody together. So you're looking at different sectors that need to get out of their silos and work together, but you're also talking about bringing together national level government with city government. There's so much alignment that needs to happen. And the same goes when we talk about industrial clusters, when we talk about heavy industry. It just requires the different stakeholders to come together that are normally operating in their silos. So from the forum's perspective, it's really important to bring the public and private together. But when we're looking at the different themes and the different sectors, that's the other piece that needs to come together, whether we're talking about in the government or whether we're talking about the private sector. So that is one of the really big challenges, and that is our role, and that's why these types of dialogues are really important. And when we put out the system value framework, it requires bringing multiple stakeholders together to think through and it provides a common language, a common narrative that multiple different stakeholders can sort of rally around and understand and grasp and be able to design and think about what could be the next steps.
Thanks, Kristen. And I think we have 5 minutes left. I have quite a few questions here, so I'm going to use mistake chairman discretion and pick. I get to pick, I guess, which ones we're going to answer. I'm going to ask all of you a question on just transition and cost and the framework in terms of like, is it going to increase electricity cost? What about a just transition? How do we make sure folks aren't left behind? Stephanie, I'm going to start with you. But while you think about the answer to that, I'm just going to really quickly, there's almost a question I can answer very quickly. There's a question here on that we focused on 3 of the framework elements. Where are the other elements? Not exactly said like that. I'm summarizing, but I just, one thing that we didn't share with everyone is a slide which had the link to the forum website. So we will circulate the link. All 12 of the elements are analyzed for all 5 countries. We just pulled the ones that were quantitatively done with the key numbers, but they are all on the website. There's like 40, 50 page slide decks for each market. And you can go on the forum site. We will send that and you can look that up. So that was one question quickly answered. And then now that last question that I want to finish with is the cost and the just transition, because we know that's like super, super important. Stephanie, can I start with you? And Kristen, I'm going to finish with you. So I'm going to start with Stephanie and finish with you and do Lisa, Francesca, and Harmeet in that order in between. So Stephanie?
Sure. Okay, Lisa, Melissa, I think we've only got 4 minutes. Is that right? So
Yes,
I'll super quick. So I think Lisa made a point that I just want to reiterate about the importance of the financial markets on the energy transition and looking at just the financial side of the energy transition. In many cases, certain investments are making very good business sense. I looked recently at stock performance of European-based utilities. European-based utilities from 2020, looking at shareholder returns, and out of the top 12, 10 had significant renewables exposure. So this is the right thing to do. We have to do it. Certain governments are mandating it. Eventually, all will. But until then, there's certainly a financial aspect of this that's important for companies to consider. And not just that, there's the need to balance, in order to meet commitments to shareholders, balance the portfolio transition, which is another challenge for businesses today. But businesses on their own can't do it, and society, governments have to step in and work together, to everyone's point here, in order to enable this transition. So that's the point I wanted to make on the last question, links to this question. That's all from me, Melissa, and I'll give others time to speak.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Lisa, do you want to comment on a just transition? I know this is something that's really, really key to Sempra.
I will, and affordability is foundational to energy access and to prosperity. In California, the world's 5th largest economy by GDP, almost 40% of our residents are at or below the poverty line. And this is a real thing that at Sempra, our businesses try to solve all the time as part of our practice. And it's why the system value framework is so attractive to us, because it recognizes that affordability and access are a key factor, and then seeks to solve for climate and resilience and other aspects around that. In the developing world, the same thing applies. So as we seek to solve emissions, looking ahead, the growth in emissions is coming from the developing world. So how can we keep affordability of cleaner energy flowing to those areas to help support prosperity, economic development, greater well-being, while in tandem addressing climate change? That's one area where we think natural gas has huge potential to accomplish all those factors. So I don't have a short answer in this period, other than to note that affordability and access are table stakes, and they are considered in the framework importantly.
Okay, so I think we are 1 minute away. So I thought I'll give Kristen the last word on that, and then I'm going to close the webinar. Kristen, do you want to have a final comment on a just transition?
Absolutely. And I would just build on what Lisa said. Absolutely, affordability and access, because we're really looking at this from a global perspective. But I would add on to their health and air quality and the location, the types of energy that we deploy when we start looking at access to cooling, when we start look at access to heating. All of that plays a really important role here. And I think that we have to be thinking about it, you know, from multiple different angles, and that's what we try to do in the framework. And I know that it really is going to vary how you're viewing the just transition by market, but we've tried to address it in there, and I think that is, you know, that is kind of something that we need to spend a bit more time focusing on in the upcoming year. How do we utilize this framework in a way that really starts to move the needle on the different solutions that can help accelerate a much more just transition? Definitely climate's important, economy's important, but equally the just transition's important.
Great, thanks, Kristen. And with that, let me close this webinar and say thanks to everyone that's joined us, and thank you to our speakers. It's been a pleasure. Great, thanks everyone. Bye.